So with me today is Cassandra, and she is a community organizer in Louisville, Kentucky. She's done a lot of different work. She's worked with United Way, the Louisville Urban League. She's studied this, passionate about it. And so I'm excited to have her on the podcast today to talk about just her work. But we're going to start kind of what drives Cassandra, like what got you into this. And I'd love to really kind of understand where this passion for you came from, because looking through your bio and having talked with you before, there's a clear path, and you meet people oftentimes where there's a direction their life is going and there's a connection on how they arrive at different. And so I'm curious, like how you got to this point. What put you on this path towards political science, community activism, community action? How did you get here?
Yeah, so it's funny that you say that, because at times I have not felt like I was on a good path.
Well, there you go.
Now that I look back at it, I do. I mean, there's a consistent theme that shows up in the work that I've done, the places that I've been at, and the work that I'm continuing to do and where I see myself moving into in the future. And that's really around being an organizer and being an advocate for Black youth, their families, and communities. So as you mentioned, the places that I've worked at and the different projects that I've worked on, that's what has been the strand that's connected all those things. And so I'm from Louisville, grew up here in the city, and was raised by my two parents that were beautiful, loving parents. My mom is from Campbellsville, Kentucky, very country. I have tons of family that still live in Campbellsville and Taylor County. And my grandmother, that's 89 years old, lives there still. And so during the summer, it would be a lot of visits to grandma's house and extended periods of time of vacation down there with her. And then my father was raised here in Louisville, grew up in Cotter Homes, which is now Park Duval, which my sister lives there now. And most of my family on my father's side grew up in West Louisville, still live in West Louisville. And so I had the opportunity of having that experience of being in the country, growing up in summers in Campbellsville, while also being here in Louisville and spending time with my family in the West End. And then our family home was in Breckenridge Lane, Buchel area. Okay. I grew up around Robin's Roost and going there, the skating parties. And so really got an opportunity to see, multiple sides of Kentucky and of Louisville. And those were really important to how I grew up and who I am today, because I think being able to be in multiple situations, different environments, allowed me to see how different things were, but also how similar things are. I also went to Catholic school, pre-K through 8th grade, right, predominantly white. I was one out of 2 Black children. There was another Black girl who is still best friends to this day, known her since I was about 4 years old. But I grew up predominantly in a white school environment, and then in a Catholic school at that, and I'm not Catholic.
I was going to ask. I was wondering how you ended up at a Catholic school, if you were Catholic or.
No, I think my parents just were really looking to have like the best education opportunity for me. My sister, that's 11 years older than me, also went to a Catholic school as well. And so and then from when I left Catholic school, I went to Manual, which was very different for me, very different, in all the positive ways. It was different. And I really enjoyed my experience at Manual, and I was super involved in everything that you can be involved in. I was doing it. And then from Manual, I went to U of L. I did not want to go to U of L at all. At all. I was looking elsewhere. I was trying to find as many scholarship opportunities. And then, my mom has worked at U of L for 43 years. I grew up on campus. I went to school right across the street at Manual, and I did not want to go to U of L. I feel like I knew everything there was to know about U of L. But tuition reimbursement is a great opportunity, and to graduate, debt free,
Can't pass it up.
is huge. So yes, I went to University of Louisville, and there I got my bachelor's of science degree in political science, concentration in law and public policy, econ minors, and Pan-African studies minors. And the reason I really selected those at the time was that I had a really great teacher in high school that was a government and politics teacher. And at the time, it was, Obama was running for office, or about like the word was getting out there. Hillary was about to run. I actually got to meet Hillary when I was in high school. And so it was all this excitement. I was like, I want to be a campaign manager. That's what I want to do. I want to be in politics. And, that's the thing. And so it was just a lot of excitement around that. I quickly found out going through undergrad, I did not want to do that at all. But I did want to be around the space of people that were making decisions that I knew impacted people that looked like me. And particularly young Black folks. And so that's why I wanted to get minors in PAS and econ. My family has always told me about the importance of knowing oneself and knowing one's culture and where you come from. And so Pan-African Studies was just a perfect fit for me. So,
well, hearing your backstory is really fascinating, because I think, we're both in Louisville, Kentucky, and I think there's a lot going on in our country, but in our community right now. And you, in your short life, have really kind of seen a lot of different perspectives of what's going, the rural, the urban, the segregation that's existed for decades, if not longer, in Louisville specifically. Being one of two Black people at an all-white Catholic school. I mean, so living in these kind of different worlds and really seeing the power of education, the opportunity that are afforded some, that are not afforded others. You mentioned this teacher. What are some, and your family as well? I'd love to learn a little bit more about what seems to be a pretty powerful influence from your family. What was that like growing up with this grandmother and these two parents that clearly have influenced you in some positive ways?
Yeah. So with my father, he actually passed when I was 15.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And it's still at times like a really touchy subject. And I think mainly because, I felt really alone at that time when I was 15, 14 years old. And even though I have like this very big family and we're connected to great friends in high school, and even those that carried over from grade school, it just felt really lonely because I didn't have anyone else that really had lost a parent and really didn't know what that felt like. So for me, I really dived really deep in being as active as possible in school. And school was like my thing, academics and extracurricular activities. But also with my mom's presence, she really reiterated to me the importance of school, and also importance of knowing oneself and knowing my culture and understanding what it meant to be a young Black girl growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, and America just in general. And so if there were any activities on U of L's campus that were, hosted by the African American Theater Department, I was there. We were there for MLK, events. We went everywhere, in our church, for Black History Month. I was also always given a poem or in some type of skit. I was always involved in extracurricular activities that had a focus on Black youth, or either if it was not a focus, it was majority Black youth. And so she was really diligent about making sure that I felt loved and cared for, but I also understood my history. And so on my father, before he passed, he also reiterated that, but it was in a different way. It was really family focused, making sure that his siblings, he had 8 brothers and sisters, and I am the youngest of about 31 first cousins.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. huge family. My dad was the first son, and so he really held on that responsibility of taking care of family. And so with the both of them, it really, and then my different experiences, it really helped paint a picture of who I am, and where my life and where my energy should be focused at.
And so all of that's kind of so now you're at an organization, Cities United, and which I think some in Louisville would be familiar with, but you guys operate actually in multiple cities across the country.
Yeah.
So give me a little bit of backstory on Cities United and the work that you're doing in communities across the United States.
Sure. Yeah. So Cities United is a national organization that's based here in Louisville, Kentucky. We work with 130 cities, 30 of them really closely, around building out our mission and vision of creating safe, healthy, and hopeful communities for Black boys, young Black boys, men, and their families, while also reducing the homicides and shooting rates amongst Black men and boys between the ages of 14 and 24 by 50%. And a lot of folks ask us, why are we so specific about that 14 to 24? Because if you look across the data, and you can go back years around data around the number of homicides and shootings, you will see that the victims of violence are typically in that age range, and they are Black men and boys. And so Cities United was created in 2011 with a couple mayors, Mayor Landrieu out of New Orleans and Mayor Nutter out of Philly. They really came together, and we're seeing this increase in the high rates of violence. And then they came together with some national organizations, Sean Dove from the Campaign of Black Male Achievement, National League of Cities, and others. And they said, we have to do something about this, as well as Dr. Bell, William C. Bell from the Casey Family Programs. So they came together and said, like, we have to do something about this. And that's how Cities United was formed. And in 2005, we had our first and our current executive director, Anthony Smith, come on board. And he's really blossomed the organization to what it is today. So we are based here in Louisville, and that really gives us an opportunity to do some really innovative projects with city government. And so that's what I get to do on a regular basis, is work on those innovative and unique strategies that we're implementing.
That's great. Because I think it's interesting, even in Louisville, I think people are familiar with Cities United, and Anthony came from the Center for Healthy Neighborhoods, I think it was, before that.
Yeah, well, he came from Network Center for Community Change, which is actually how we met. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And I think, so sometimes people assume Cities United is just this Louisville-based effort, and there is a lot of work that you do with the government and also in Louisville, Kentucky, but 130 cities across the country, and in a very laser-focused effort to really hone in on how to support Black males, young Black males specifically, which is really interesting because in a previous podcast, we talked about overcriminalization and just the criminal justice system as a whole, and the real need to focus on how do we mitigate, how do we reduce criminal deviancy. And some of the best ways we can do that are by providing good role models, connecting young Black men specifically with role models. How do we strengthen families? How do we strengthen the home? And so I think there's a lot of great studies around, like, let's, this war on drugs and the volume of people that are in our criminal justice system could be reduced if we actually help provide many of the resources to people and families and communities. So the work you guys do is pretty amazing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Our approach to violence prevention is looking at it from a public health lens. We understand that there's many factors that go into why communities are experiencing high rates of community violence. And for us, looking at those root causes is essential in the work that we do. And so those root causes are some of the things that you mentioned around having stable housing, education, youth services, family supports, employment, healthcare, especially mental and physical health. And so we look into all of those as we build out strategies in partnership with mayors and city governments and community organizations and those that have been most impacted by violence. We look at those different factors as we build out plans with cities around how they can reduce that. And we also look at how do we redefine, reimagine public safety. Because oftentimes when folks think about public safety, they go automatically to the police. And so we want to shift that and help the public actually understand that those root causes of violence are actually there. And if we can address those, we can really see a big difference, not only with the reduction of violence, but also in really getting to that mission and that vision of safe and healthy communities.
And the emphasis on mental and emotional is really fascinating, because I think the effects of trauma, there's this big growing conversation around just trauma. It's something I think everyone is affected by trauma in different ways. People experience trauma differently. It might be postpartum, it might be sexual abuse, sexual assault, but there's also just like the effects of violence and the trauma that creates on people and communities. And then really, if you can actually address that from a public health perspective, what does that have? What effect does that have on a long-term trajectory for a community? So I think that's an interesting, because I haven't heard, and I love that you guys are adding that and really talking about the public health effects of violence on communities, because that's where these things are perpetuated, is when we don't address these at a root issue and address the factors that lead to criminal deviancy, that then ultimately, like you said, public safety is more than policing. Policing should be the final, we shouldn't try to use it as we do measure in communities. So.
Yeah, and there's other ways to address the issues that we see in society. So, if someone is having a mental health break, police may, is not the best to respond in that situation. There's mental health counselors that can be deployed to address situations like that. And so that's part of our work that we're doing with cities, is definitely helping to kind of reimagine, like in situations like that, what other resources can really be invested in that can be issued out in prevention practices, but also in the moment, if there are moments of violence happening, and then the after effects around the trauma and healing pieces.
Do you share best? Oh, sorry. Do you share best practices among the cities? Because I think that's a really fascinating thing to be where you are and sitting and saying, okay, this is what we're going to address, and looking and working with 130 different cities. You've got to have a repository of cities that are doing it well in certain areas. Like, what are some examples of communities that you think their procedures or applications of public health or public safety could be replicated and really address some of the things that we're seeing in our communities across the country right now?
Yeah, so because we do work in so many cities, it is a great place to really learn which strategies are being employed where and how those can be replicated, and those models can be replicated elsewhere. And so there are some great cities that are doing work around violence interruptions practices. So there are folks that are out in the street that are having conversations with those that may be victims of violence, or maybe the perpetrators of violence, and really trying to have like those conflict resolution conversations and really encouraging them to go other ways instead of retaliation. And so there are cities that are doing those models, like in Philly, they have a violence prevention. There's also Cure Violence as a model. And so those cities, like Philly, is typically up northeast, that are doing those types of activities. But you also have other cities that are really looking at their budgeting and figuring out, like, okay, so we do spend so much money on police, but we don't spend so much on education. And education keeps getting peeled back further and further, or we don't spend as much money around health or family support. So let's really do some reassessment. There's also cities like in Stockton, California, with Mayor Tubbs, who is a young mayor, who I think just turned 30, same age as me, doing phenomenal work around how do you give universal basic income to families. If we keep talking about poverty and we need to solve poverty, and folks need money.
Yeah.
They need the opportunity to bring in some additional income and to support their family in the moment, but also plan for the future.
And we're seeing the Mayor Stubbs, he's actually had some really good traction, and there was a lot of skepticism around what this would look like, and he's like, I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna show that it works. And he's actually demonstrated some pretty interesting and compelling results. And I think we're also seeing some of that too with what's going on with COVID and and the checks to families in the midst of crisis, and how that really has helped, if nothing else, from a mental and emotional health perspective, just to be able to take a breath and kind of press forward and not really be concerned too much with that $1,200 that's super nice in the pocket. So I am curious, what are some of the roadblocks? Because I think the models you mentioned are awesome, and you think, okay, if these principles, maybe not like cookie cutter, different city governments do things differently. What are some of the issues, the roadblocks that you're seeing as you work in all these different communities, from really trying to apply what works in Philly into other markets? Is it unions, like the police unions? Are they strong? Like you mentioned, budgets. Like where's the roadblock?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think they vary. But I do think, like, if I had to like summarize it, it really comes down to some fundamental like differences in like values and in beliefs in why violence is happening in cities. And so some people just have not bought into that public health approach. They don't believe that it is these different factors, that people are living in neighborhoods and in environments where there's limited choices, limited options, and they truly believe that folks are inherently bad, and because they are inherently bad, they are making bad choices. And so, and I think if decisions around budgets or around policy or whatever, when you really like peel it back, you really got to get to like, what is that person, that institution's value system? What do they really believe in about individuals, about families and communities? And so that hesitation from being able to really shift budgets or to change policies or to start implementing different strategies, to me really comes down to like that true belief and value system.
That's an interesting way to frame it, because I think, in the investment world, we do a lot around investments, and I think there's almost two camps, as you've kind of put it, where you either believe the way to get money, that there's enough money out there, and if you work hard enough, you pick yourself up by the bootstraps, is a common phrase, and you have a good idea, it's inevitably gonna get money, and almost this discounting of the fact that the educational circles you run in, the community circles you run in, the gender circles you run in, the racial circles you run in, have afforded you a measure of privilege and access that isn't open to everyone, or the fact that you live in a certain community and banks are more willing to lend to you, or you have a family member. I mean, the staggering statistic for me is, as a white guy, the average family in America has $100,000 in net worth, and the average black family has $7,600. So when you talk about access to capital and opportunity, and the first place you go is your family and friend network, that's a pretty staggering statistic. And so I think you're really spot on. And I think that's a really great way to say it. There's a fundamental difference of values, and we're seeing it played out nationally, right? This idea of like, if you truly believe there is privilege, or if there's not. Or, we're talking about, I think I saw yesterday on CNN that they were interviewing Attorney General Barr, and he was basically saying that he didn't believe systemic. There were two justice systems, that systemic racism was not a reality. And so I think as this plays out, this is how it's manifest in communities, and how we think about budgets and priorities for public health versus policing. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, if you have benefited from, being able to be in privileged classes, you're going to be hesitant to acknowledge that where your privilege comes from, and acknowledge that some of the things that you own, or the spaces that you can be in, you're allowed to be in, have really been not from being able to pull yourself up from your bootstraps, but really been based on how you look, or your family lineage. And so I think America is dealing with that right now, everywhere, across the country, in cities, and you see that in the uprisings in the major cities across the country, and you see that here in Louisville.
Yeah, and I think it's a person by person thing, because I know, even for myself, growing up, you don't ever want to be able to say like, I I didn't earn this. Like, I worked really hard. I went to college. I was a military officer. I earned these things. And I think there's a measure of truth, but I also think I have to acknowledge that I was afforded the opportunity to go to these institutions of higher learning and get these jobs because of who I am. And I think you have to kind of come to that process of understanding what that looks like and what that means. And it doesn't diminish what you might have achieved as an individual, but you have to at least say you were one lap in on a 1 mile course. Or
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3. And that those two things can be true.
Right. Right.
That's good. So I want to flip a little bit, because at Cities United, you guys do a lot of different things, but I think one of the things here you do in Louisville is you help manage the Russell Place of Promise effort. So talk to me a little bit about that. And I think specifically with this, I see a lot of your community activism and organization come out. So I'd love to hear what Russell Place Promise is doing and really how you're trying to approach it maybe differently than how some community work's done.
Yeah, so Russell Place of Promise is a economic justice-based initiative that's focused on Black wealth building in the Russell neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky. And so Russell, just for context for folks that are listening and watching, Russell is west of 9th Street. It is north of Broadway, east of 32nd Street, and south of Market. It's a pretty large neighborhood. It is considered the gateway of the West, since it is just right across west of 9th Street and the most northeast neighborhood of the West End. And the work that we're doing is, to me, is extremely important for Russell. Russell, it was once known as the Harlem of the South. It was the place where it's rumored that Langston Hughes used to come and hang out. It was an economically vibrant neighborhood for Black Louisvillians, as well as not only economically, but it had a major arts and culture scene. Black Louisvillians and Black folks across the region used to come to Russell to hang out, to party, to do business, to eat, to dine. And it was just, from what I can read and the stories I've heard from Black elders, is that it was a beautiful place to be, and still is today. But as we think back around the decades of redlining, and urban renewal and other really racist policies and practices that came from not only government, but as well as the private sector, it really decimated what was that beautifully vibrant, economically vibrant neighborhood. And after several decades of disinvestment, divestment, you really see the impacts of what the neighborhood has experienced with, kind of removing the opportunities for home ownership for Black residents and the possibility, making it harder for Black businesses to thrive. And so through it all, though, Russell has maintained a lot of its history from Central High School, being the home of the high school that Muhammad Ali and Alberta Jones and many other Black leaders have come through and come from. It has still maintained those assets and the people that have always called Russell home. And so, as we look across the country, Russell is not different from a lot of other historically Black neighborhoods across the country. If you look at other cities like DC or in Philly or on the West Coast, you will see that if you look at historically Black and brown neighborhoods, the urban renewal, redlining, other practices like that really destroy what was once there. And communities have struggled to gain that back. In Russell, as well as other neighborhoods around West Louisville and downtown, there's a large number of investment that's coming into the neighborhood and surrounding. And typically, when that happens, hundreds of $millions of investment goes into neighborhoods. Gentrification is on the rise. And we've just seen it in a lot of different places. And so gentrification hurts the ability of residents and businesses and churches and community-based organizations that have always called those neighborhoods and Russell home, hurt their abilities to be able to be stabilized and be able to really grow and thrive. And so Russell Place of Promise is an opportunity to really focus in those individuals, those residents, those businesses, those other stakeholders, to invest in the existing and those that former, that have moved out, but due to displacement, but want to be rooted in Russell, really an opportunity to invest in those people and places that make Russell special.
That's good. And you mentioned gentrification, because I think whenever you get to community work, that often comes up. And I was curious if we could camp out there a little bit, because the term gentrification is really actually only about a half a century old. And there's a lot of kind of confusion around what that, so some people will say that and they mean one thing. And so I'm curious, because like on some levels, people look at gentrification and it's a 4-letter word. It's displacement. It's like a virus. And others, it's community development. It's improvement. And then for most, it really brings a sense of anxiety, fear, and concern. And so for you, as you step into the work in Russell Place of Promise, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? What does that mean to the community? And what measures are you taking to really thoughtfully work with the community to realize a rebuilding of wealth?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think sometimes terms are thrown out and people have different meanings and different values for those terms. And so the way that we think about gentrification is really, when we hear that term, it's gentrification and investment. Typically, community development has traditionally been at the hands of people that do not live in the neighborhood and are not connected to the neighborhood. And so for us, it's extremely important for our POB, that's what we call Russell Place of Promise for short, is that our POB is really led by residents, and that it as an organization is led by Black people, residents that either live in Russell, live in West End, or care about it, or have worshiped in, or have connections, familiar connections to the neighborhood, or just have really values that are in alignment with being transparent, being considerate, also understanding that it is not for a typical investor that would come in. It's like, I'm just trying to get a return on my investment. I'm just worried about what I have, my wealth, but for us, it's really about, if folks are going to be investing, how do you do investment in partnership with those that have always called Russell home? Mm-hmm. It is not folks coming in and just investing in a property and getting their return on benefits, but it's how do we ensure that residents also have a stake in ownership? Because as you look at Russell, whether it is commercial or residential real estate, you will see a lot of that is not owned by Russell residents, and it's not owned by Black-led organizations or Black places of faith or businesses. It is owned by outside entities that don't have a connection. Yeah. And so for us, that's we're trying to shift that.
And I think that's a really helpful definition, because it's not saying folks from the outside of that community can't participate, but I think that the idea of connection, purpose, community-led is really powerful, because I think on some levels it's the way you describe gentrification is gentrification that is almost like a modern-day colonization. Mm-hmm. Is what we're talking about. Like mm-hmm. that's the negative gentrification, where historically white money has come from the outside and bought up nice buildings and increased property values with no thought to the residents or people that have connections. Maybe they don't live there, but they have a connection to that community. Right. And that wasn't considered in the redevelopment of that community. So that's helpful, because I think that really sets the table well for the work that you're trying to do. And so I think it takes time though. Because so as an investor or as someone that's like, okay, I get this, I desire for the community, but that takes a lot of time. So talk to me about like what the time that goes, like what do you do in the midst of trying to make sure that the people connected and the community are participating at the table, making these decisions?
Yeah, so the project, RPOP launched 2 years ago. And since then, we've built out an outreach team. We have about 5 members on our outreach team. They either live in Russell or live in West Louisville, which is extremely important for us. And we have been and will continue to focus on that relationship building piece. So we have members of our team that are on a regular everyday basis working with Russell residents to get them connected to resources that they need, especially right now during COVID. Those Russell residents that are concerned about rent payments and mortgages and things like that. We are also working very closely with the existing Black businesses in the neighborhood. We have a business accelerator that we're actually launching later this month with 12 businesses that are either located in Russell or West Louisville, and trying to get them connected to the different COVID relief funds, as well as also getting them connected to other Black businesses that can support them in their development. And we've also been working with faith leaders in the community and supporting them and making sure that they, since church services and worship services have been on a halt, and tithes and offerings have not been coming in. And, folks are concerned with the properties that they own, trying to just make sure that they get support, the financial support, so they can make sure that their church still is thriving and that their congregation members are also feeling supported. So this past couple years and moving into 2021, for us is really about that relationship building piece and building a partnership with all the different stakeholders, especially residents. And so over this next couple of months, we're actually moving into a process of building out a partnership agreement with residents, where we're going to be engaging with 25 residents about RPOP, trying to identify the priorities with our wealth building strategies around home ownership, business retention creation, workforce development, and community ownership of assets. We're going to go through that and try to prioritize those, build out an accountability structure for RPOP staff and the advisory board. And then also think about, like, what is RPOP going to be in a couple years? Because it's not going to stay in the incubation phase for much longer. And so we need to be thinking about, like, what does RPOP need to become to really be able to meet all the goals and meet the needs and wants of residents. And so we'll be going through that process with a few residents in the next couple months, which really makes me excited, my community organizer heart, to be focusing on that and also doing some leadership development work.
That's busy and good. That's awesome. So I'd love to, because I think what I've really enjoyed in our conversation is you're very passionate and I think focused on what's to come. I'd love to know from an RPOP perspective, from a Cassandra perspective, what does success look like? If we're able to achieve what you're set out to do, what does that look like? And I don't need a timetable. It could be 2 years, it could be 20 years, but what would success look like in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think success looks like as we look at the neighborhood in a few years from now, is that there are places in the neighborhood that have been here that are still here. There are new places, new that are owned by residents that they can say, hey, I built that, or hey, I own that, or I decorated that, or I constructed this with my own hands, or I had a part in building this out, a part of being a part of the strategic planning, and really being proud. Because I think we have, in Russell, there are so many proud residents already there, but just to be able to look at places and spaces and say, like, I had a part of that. I want RPOP to be a part of that picture and be able to really shift the way ownership of the neighborhood looks, to really into the hands of Black residents and those business owners and places of faith and other stakeholders that really call Russell home.